And I am pleased to call to order what I think will be our last meeting in 2013, and that would be the 100th meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, hard to believe, on December 19th, 9:30 at the Boston Convention Center. First item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Commissioner McHugh.
We have, Mr. Chairman, two sets of minutes. The first is in tab 2A. It's the minutes of December 3, 2013. And I would, they're in the book. I'd move their adoption as printed in the book with leave to make technical and typographical corrections.
Second.
Any discussions on the minutes? Seem fine to me. All in favor of adoption?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously.
The second set of minutes is in tab 2B. I'd make the same motion, i.e. that we adopt them as printed, subject to technical and typographical, correction of technical and typographical matters.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously.
Now, the agenda calls for us to deal with a third set of minutes, but, and those are for the December 13 meeting. Those are not ready. We want to, before preparing those, check the transcript to make sure that we have recorded motions accurately. So we'll have those.
Which meeting, which was
next.
that? Which meeting?
The December 13 meeting was a meeting where we discussed a number of important matters.
As always.
As always. But I must confess,
Specifically
at the
which?
moment,
I recall
can't
those
remember
important
which they
matters.
I
They were
know
long motions.
they were really important.
they were,
It was our meeting where it was in between our suitability hearing, the meeting where we came out of suitability on Monday and then talked about arbitration
right.
matters and then went out.
Right,
So
right,
all right,
that's
right.
what that was.
great,
right.
okay.
And the December 16 minutes are in tab 2D, but they're not on the agenda, so I think we'll wait for approval of those till our January 9 meeting.
Okay, great. Then we'll move on to the racing division, starting with Director Dernberger.
Good morning, Mr.
Morning.
Chair, Commissioners.
Good morning.
I can't let too much time go by without keeping racing in front of you, so I just wanted to give you a brief update this morning on some industry matters, things that are happening out there in the rest of the country. And then we're going to talk about some changes that were approved by the Commission back in October and their timeline for the rulemaking process. So I've just recently returned from a series of meetings, 3 of them, in fact. There was the Association of Regulatory Veterinary Conference, the Association of Racing Commissioners International Winter Conference, and that was held in conjunction with the Global Symposium on Racing. The RCI Model Rules Committee met for 2 days to discuss a number of new rules and amendments to existing rules. Of particular note that I'd like to put before you is the contemplation of another schedule of drugs or substances that we would regulate by threshold, and that's titled Endogenous Dietary and Environmental Substances. You'll recall that last year the industry made a paradigm shift where we distinguished between prohibited substances, which have no business being in a horse at all on race day, and controlled therapeutic medications, which we recognize are therapeutically valuable to the horse, but we want to regulate them at a level such that they don't have any effect on performance. And that was a really important paradigm shift for the industry to make. And this is this new schedule, proposed schedule, introduces this third category. And it's adopted at the request of the horsemen. It's really a due process issue. Horses live in an environment that is contaminated, if you will, by that which grows in the field, that which is in the processing machinery at the feed mill, that which is on the hands of the people that take care of their daily needs. And so from the horseman's perspective, if you are the absolute insurer of the horse's condition, and that's a settled case, that's a settled question in our industry, then it would be good if there were threshold levels for those substances that are essentially an occupational hazard of being a horse, if that makes sense to you. So the trick is twofold for these things. One is that the threshold that we adopt has to be supported by science. We've talked in the past about how these medication rules originate. They're deep in subcommittee, people who have an awful lot of letters after their last name. They bring forth the recommendations, and so that process has started. The second part, of course, though, is that we need to find out whether or not there's a level beyond which there is an effect on performance. And so the National Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association, which is the national group, our thoroughbred horsemen belong to the New England chapter. They've submitted a list of, I think, 23 substances that they'd like to see on that schedule. Right now, we have the science to support 8, so the take-home message is that we're still going to be hearing more about that. The reason is that this becomes a resource issue. So do we devote the bulk of our available funds on administration studies on the science part? These substances typically result only in a handful of fairly benign violations every year. Or do we devote our limited resources to pursuing sort of more malevolent, what's the word I'm looking for? Really
That's
bad
it.
stuff.
That's the one.
You know, it's a resource issue. If you're the guy, though, that gets popped for a caffeine overage, for example, then it's a matter of huge import to you, and that's the kind of substance we're talking about. There's caffeine in the environment. It can show up in the horses. Obviously, if you got a lot of caffeine in you, as I do this morning, you take off at an extreme rate of speed. So that's the issue there. We're going to be hearing more about it. The RCI Board of Directors meeting, I wanted to let you know that we heard from the president of the United States Trotting Association, Mr. Phil Langley, on their
United
recent...
States what?
The United States Trotting Association.
Trotting. Sorry.
Yep. This is the group that recently withdrew its support for the Uniform Medication Initiative and its seat as well on the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium Board. This is the organization, of course, that comes up with these threshold recommendations. I would characterize the discussion as being respectful on both sides. Mr. Langley and the USTA continue to assert the position that the adopted thresholds on a couple of the medications will preclude their therapeutic use in standard-bred racehorses because of the business model. We heard that discussion at our horse racing forum in October. The RCI position continues to be that it should be the effect on the horse and not the business model that drives our threshold decisions. So uniformity, of course, being of the utmost importance to the racing industry at this time. Basically what we've done, Mr. Alex Waldrop, who you remember spoke to you at the horse racing forum, he chairs the RMTC, and he invited the USTA to continue the dialogue, and that invitation was positively received. So I think that we haven't closed any doors. We're trying to keep everybody in the fold within the industry as we move forward on the uniformity initiative. Just briefly, at the Regulatory Veterinarians Conference, we heard about some really exciting industry initiatives that we could potentially be a part of next year, and I hope we can be. Our industry as a whole is getting a lot better about funding and coming up with some partnerships, local veterinary schools, research centers, and we hope that we can continue that trend here in Massachusetts in the coming years. We're becoming a very data-driven sport, and that's a good thing. We've also been invited by the Racing Officials Accreditation Program to be part of a beta testing program involving an enhanced administrative ruling database. We're likely to make the recommendation.
Administrative what database?
Administrative rulings. And we're likely to recommend being involved in that because this is going to be basically recommending best practices for these administrative rulings, and we're all about best practices in the racing division, and I know that's important to this commission as well. So as that unfolds, we'll put some kind of proposal in front of you. That's probably a late spring initiative. What else can I tell you? The Global Symposium on Racing was informative. We got lots of business done there before and after the meetings. Lots of folks there from jurisdictions all over the country and North America.
Lots of business done, like what?
Like discussing reform, pari-mutuel
Okay,
in particular.
industry business, not our racing division business particularly.
No, just in
Industry,
particular,
yeah,
yep,
okay.
innovative ideas and ways to make the product better. I think that was really the focus this year, was how do we improve the product? Because when you improve the product, you bring more money in, and that's everybody's goal. One of the most important things probably to happen in racing all year happened during that meeting. There is now a Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance. The Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance formed in 2012, and they recently named a group of 23 aftercare retirement organizations that went through a rigorous accreditation process. And they also received grant money, and this was a really big deal. And the reason for that is it completes what I call the horse racing industry, the winning trifecta. And the winning trifecta is the safety initiatives. A lot of those began in 2008 and 2009. Sensible regulation and uniformity, and that's where we come in. And this commitment to aftercare now, so that when the race is over, the horses have somewhere to go. We're in great shape in all three in Massachusetts, and we hope to continue that trend. And finally, some really good news for the Commission. Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 128A, Section 5H, provides for a $20,000 fund to assist folks employed in the thoroughbred industry in Massachusetts who are experiencing unexpected economic hardship. And it was my pleasure to be able to approve 4 of those requests this week, just in time for the holidays. Typically, these requests involve unexpected medical leave due to accident or unforeseen illness. They often come from people that either don't qualify for FMLA or have exhausted their leave. And so it's my hope that these awards this week will help alleviate some of the difficulties that these folks are facing. So,
How much were the awards?
the individual awards depend on the documentation that the folks provide. It's a $20,000 fund, though, and we do use that up every year. Just wanted to remind you that racing really does take care of its own, and this is one way we do that.
Great.
Great.
I have a question just on the uniformity discussion or topic. Do you see that eventually the industry will move towards 2 different set of standards or thresholds, one for standardbred and one for thoroughbred? It just seems that they come from different, there's merit to each of the associations that have a different breed, but there seems to be this impasse, if that's the right word.
I don't know that it's reached an impasse yet, and the reason for that is the commissions in North America. The majority of those that have signed on to the Uniform Initiative have passed the same rules in both breeds. There are 3 or 4, just so you guys know, an update. We've recently had some new jurisdictions sign on. You'll recall that we were part of an original gang of 8. It was a Mid-Atlantic and New England consortium. The 8 now has grown to 11, and we've included now some major horse racing jurisdictions, California and just last week Kentucky, which passed the same rules for both sets of
Great.
breeds.
That's really good.
There are still 3 that are contemplating doing both, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. I think that the business model versus the science model is a good one. It's a good distinction to make. It's a philosophical decision as well. In other words, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to regulate the medications that are in the horse and the effect that it has on the horse long term, for example? Or are we trying to change the way that we treat the horse to fit a business model? Some of the things that were discussed at the RCI Board of Directors meeting were some little tweaks. Maybe that could be made to the business model, and then that would solve that problem. So those are something that the industry is looking at. So I wouldn't characterize it as an impasse. The other piece of it is that Massachusetts is a really good example where the thoroughbred business model isn't that different from the standardbred model. A lot of the horses that raced at Suffolk raced every week. So you could also approach that question from, you know, do you make the distinction between the breeds or how they race? And you can imagine very quickly that you would have 2 sets of standards for the same breed. This thoroughbred races every 5 days, therefore he should be subject to this category of rules. And this thoroughbred races every week, so he should be subject to this category of rules. I mean, that's kind of the standardbred argument. They race every week. It's a different business model. Well, a lot of our thoroughbreds race every week. Maybe not all year, but they do race a lot more frequently in some jurisdictions than others.
Do the standardbreds only race every week? I thought they raced more frequently even within a week.
They could. That cycle, typically that doesn't last all year long, but you can get clusters of races, certainly. Again, this, part of that is driven by the shortage of horses.
Right.
So, you may see a horse running on a Thursday and again on a Sunday. That becomes of concern to the industry, but that's part of the pressure to keep the horses in the entry box, keep the fields full, keep the races going, keep the number of race days up.
So it's just I was going to pursue the same angle, the same topic. Is your personal belief, that there should be a standard, that a single standard, that there shouldn't be, there are not ultimately defensible reasons for having two sets of, even splits, even minimal places where there's splits in standards.
I strongly believe in a uniform threshold proposal based on the science. I will say that there are minor differences. Quarter horses and standard breds sometimes run, they have what they call trials or futurities that qualify you to get into a stakes race. Excuse me, and the timing of that sometimes is such that that trial race or that futurity comes 6 or 7 days before the big race that you're qualifying to get into. So one of the things talked about at the RCI Board of Directors meeting, and one of the things that a racetrack that I worked at in Louisiana did, was they just backed up that race, that qualifying race, they backed that up 1 day to help accommodate that. So I think there are some minor tweaks that can be made to reflect the reality of the business model, but I don't think you make your decisions on medicating the horse based on the business model.
As a veterinarian, is there a difference that's significant between what the body of the horse goes through in a standard bred race as opposed to a thoroughbred race? And looking at it, you get a sense that one is sort of a very controlled, limited set of muscles, different set of muscles, and in a constraint that's in a way actually holds back maximum exertion. Whereas in a thoroughbred race, it looks like it's all about absolute maximum exertion. Is that a significant matter?
We can debate the significance of the matter. There's no physiological difference between the breeds, and we hear that term being used in this industry discussion right now, that they're physiologically different, but the use is different. And we do know, based on science and as a veterinarian, that the way, for example, that you stress bone responds to the stresses that are put on it. It's Wolff's Law. It's a very basic tenet of science, is that, you know, if the bone is subject to a lot of compression in one angle, then it redistributes the different cells and it makes it stronger to withstand that. So there are differences in use, but overall I don't think that the recommendations that are being put forth by the scientists are in conflict with that at all.
Could you take a thoroughbred colt and train it to be a standard bred colt?
Yes, could you, so for example, one of the things that's happening in standard bred racing right now, to turn that on its head, is they are having pari-mutuel races with standard breds under saddle. So they're being ridden
Under
instead of,
saddle?
yep. So they're being ridden often by celebrity jockeys to bring folks in, but yeah, that's
Like Danielle.
like Danielle. You've just been volunteered to participate.
That'd be fun.
There are some gait differences. So, for example, the pace, which is one of the gaits that the standard bred horse has, is not a natural gait to the thoroughbred.
Right.
It's also not necessarily a natural gait to all standard breds. Some are trotters.
Right.
So can you train them to be used differently? Yes.
Interesting. I think we need some more 15 minutes of racing.
I know. This is wonderful to have
Yeah.
the time to talk to
Yeah,
you this
it's
morning.
great. Anybody else? Questions on the update? Great.
Oh, it sounds
Fascinating. It's
really
yeah,
fascinating stuff, yeah.
yeah.
We should do this more often.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's totally appropriate. I mean, there has been a fair amount of things going on, but it's not always going to be like this. And having substantive updates like this is really constructive and helpful. So it would be, you know, we should make sure that this gets on the agenda once in a while, just for our interest's sake, if nothing else. Thanks.
Okay, so the next item is our amended medication and penalty regulations. You'll recall that the racing division faces a unique rulemaking requirement in that our regulations have to go up to the legislature for review before they become effective. We have amendments and enhancements to 205 CMR 3.29 and 4.52. This is medications and penalties. They were approved at a public meeting by this commission on October 17th. And have been duly filed, and I'll have Attorney Daniel Holmes describe to you where we are in that timeline and discuss the small business impact statement that'll need to be filed soon.
Before you start, I was just thinking it might be possible that we could influence one of our major metropolitan newspapers, if any of them happen to be represented here today, to do some kind of a feature on the horse racing industry, because it's kind of an, you know, there's all these interesting factors involved and decision points being made, and you know, it'd be interesting. I think people other than we would be interested in knowing this story. If anybody happens to be in the room, to happen to know an editor. Or anything. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The racing division has put before you their amended small business impact statement, and the final version of the regulation changes to 205 CMR 3.29 and 4.52. We are just looking for your approval to file them with the Secretary of State.
This, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The regulations are the ones that are unchanged from the version that we sent to the legislature?
Yes.
Yeah.
The 60 days at the legislature is up tomorrow, so we would be getting your approval to file them contingent upon receiving no adverse comments from the legislature by tomorrow. We have not received anything from them yet.
And they're
Has there
not,
been any direct communication? You've talked with some of them,
Not on this set
the
of rule
legislators?
changes.
Okay.
I've gotten just minor emails for them asking for PDF forms and stuff, so they.
From the
or
legislature?
From the
So
legislature.
they are following
To have
it.
them in
Good.
electronic form, so they have them.
Right, great,
And they receive them.
great,
Good.
good.
And if tomorrow we got some something, what would it take tomorrow to stop this process? Would it take a formal vote or an expression of anxiety by some committee chair or or representative? What would stop this?
There is an action that the legislature takes. I would have to check and see, but they would tell us that they disapprove them, and so we would have to,
So it'd be a formal kind
Be
of thing,
formal,
not just a phone
yes.
call from somebody, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And then we'd come back before the
Right.
commission again and revise them.
Okay. Interesting
We
process.
would in
Unique, I guess.
It's unique,
Yeah,
yeah.
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 I was just wondering whether maybe 9 nanograms per millimeter of ketoprofen wouldn't be better than 10.
And this is why these rules start deep, deep, deep in subcommittee. But it's also, to pick up on that if I can, and I don't know how many folks in the industry are watching this, but when we get to these debates, after it started in subcommittee, and these folks who actually do this stuff for a living
Right.
make these recommendations, and then it goes through and it gets approved by one committee, goes to the next committee, gets approved by the board, comes to the model, actually comes into RCI through the Drug Testing and Standards Practices Committee, then goes to Model Rules Committee, then to the Board of Directors. And so if at that point somebody raises their hand and says, whoa, it makes you think, really? We've been doing this for 2 years looking at
Right.
these numbers, so.
Well, it's a pretty impressive process, actually, that
Yeah,
I mean,
it
that you can get this many data points through that much of a process, through that many people and opinions, and I'm sure it's agonizing, but it's pretty impressive once it gets through it.
Agonizing, and it takes a lot of resources, so anyone out there who wants to donate to the RMTC, keep the fight fighting. That's a good thing to do.
Oh, that's great.
Great. All right.
So we need a vote here, right? We need a motion to file the small business impact statement
We're
and,
doing that separately or the same?
The amended small business impact statement has to be filed before the final version of the regulations are filed, and can be filed within the 60 days that the regs are at the legislature. So that will get filed first, and then the final version of the regulations will be filed at least a day later.
all right, so maybe we ought to have two motions. The first being authorize I move that we authorize the filing of the small business impact statement with the appropriate authorities forthwith.
Second? Any
Second.
further- Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously.
Then I would move that we file with the Secretary of State the new versions of 205 CMR 3.29 and 4.52 as soon as the the 60 days elapses and the day between filing the small business impact statement and the minimum time for filing occurs.
Second.
Everybody get that?
Not sure I do.
We might need some more caffeine.
Right. You want me- yeah. Add the ability for technical adjustments to
Right,
that
right.
amendment.
Right.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
That concludes the racing division's portion this morning.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Racing
thank you
Division.
very much.
Happy holidays.
Same to
Happy
you.
holidays.
And item number 4 on the agenda is the Legal Division, General Counsel Blue.
Good morning. I would like to ask Mr. Ziemba and Mr. Grossman to join me, since I'm sure they will want to weigh in on the topics that we have in front of us. So the first matter before us this morning is the waiver request filed by Mohegan Sun and the City of Revere. This is the waiver request that was filed in response to the discussion at our December 10th commission meeting. The waiver was timely filed with the commission. As you recall, there was a 7-day time limit. It was received by the commission within that time limit. And the waiver request, the waiver that we discussed, which is the ability to file the certification of the election after the RFA2 application.
Comments on the waiver or anything else?
Well, I looked at the, as I'm sure we all did, I looked at the request, and it certainly conforms to the requirements we adopted in our vote. And I guess that's really all I have to say, and so I would be in favor of allowing the request.
We got a letter from the city opposing it. City of Boston, right, based in part on the fact that they have not seen it. And I don't know that that's necessarily a precondition, but I wonder if maybe if we could ask the representatives from Mohegan Sun and Suffolk Downs, apparently it's been requested. Is there some reason why Boston hasn't seen or been given the waiver?
We were unaware of the request, but we'll submit it as we need it.
Okay. It says, although requested, the commission has not provided, oh, I'm sorry, the commission has not
We
provided the
didn't
city.
know.
Oh, I take that back. Rather blame you
fine,
guys. Well, I don't know about that. Did we get a request from the city for some reason?
We did get a request in the last few days, and we thought it was appropriate for the commission to be able to review it first before releasing it publicly. It is in the commission package. It is up on our website now.
I don't know that I would have agreed with that, but it's not exactly a secret, but whatever. All right. All right, well, is there any other comment on the waiver?
No.
Do you want to make a motion, Commissioner?
Yes, I move that the commission grant the request by Mohegan Sun Massachusetts LLC and the City of Revere for a waiver of 205 CMR 119.017 to permit the filing of a certified copy of the results of a vote that they have committed to hold after the deadline for submission of RFA2 applications on December 31, 2013.
Second?
Second.
I think this is such an important issue to a lot of people. I just think it should be noted. I kind of hate to let this just slide through without comment. You know, we have wrestled hard with trying to figure out how to reconcile the no vote in East Boston with the yes vote in Revere. And there is no perfect solution. There's nothing clear in the law, the regs that tells us exactly what to do. We've been trying to figure out what's the fairest way to go forward. Commissioner McHugh came up with a very, I think, creative and substantively helpful approach that I think we all agree with. I think we're sensitive to the fact that it's an imperfect situation. There's no perfect reconciliation here, but I can't think of a better way to try to reconcile this issue. and I appreciate Commissioner McHugh coming up with it, and, but I just want to note that we're sensitive to the fact that there are competing interests and competing passions on this, and we're doing the best that we can to figure out a fair and reasonable way to approach it. Any other discussion? Then all in favor of the motion as framed by Commissioner McHugh signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
The next item on the agenda is what we call the arbitration handbook. We've received a number of requests and questions regarding the arbitration process, and so we worked with outside counsel to put together a guidebook to answer some of those questions. We hope that this would be helpful. We wanted the commission to take a look at it and to get your thoughts and your comments on it. There were two questions that have come up. The best and final question we discussed at our last meeting, there was some question about the ability of the arbitrator to have flexibility in terms of conforming its reporter award up to 23K. And I think, John, there was one other question that we got.
There's a question regarding the applicability of the Uniform Arbitration Act.
That's right. And we did discuss that with outside counsel, who has done the research for us and advises us that the Uniform Arbitration Act is not applicable to this situation. This is arbitration by statute. That act applies to arbitration by written agreement or contract.
Would you say that again?
Our outside counsel.
Not the
no.
outside counsel part. This is arbitration by,
This is arbitration required by statute as opposed to an agreement or by contract.
I see, yes, right. Well, we came up with the, what the statute requires is that the commission create a mechanism for resolution of impasses in the surrounding community agreement process. And the commission created this arbitration
Yes.
process in fulfillment of that statutory obligation.
That's correct.
Basically the way we get the statutory driver for the arbitration process.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay. Well, I agree with that. I think it is not governed by the statutory arbitration rules.
The uniform, the 251, right?
251,
Right, Chapter
that's correct.
251.
It is not
Right.
governed, that was my.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Go ahead.
No, I had a couple of other questions, unless there's further discussion on that piece.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. If we, if for some reason we thought that 251 applied here, our timeline would be entirely different and much longer. That was, in my estimation, never the intention. When we looked at the timeline, we knew, and I suspect we contemplated that this arbitration had to be short in nature so that we could get to a resolution quickly. And that would be, that the specter of that timeline would really weigh in on hopefully incentivizing the parties to reach a negotiated agreement prior to that arbitration. If 251 applied, we would be here next year. So it's next year, as in not this January, but next December,
Yeah.
Yeah.
without a surrounding community or awards, and that is just simply never what we contemplated. And it's not in the interest of our mission, I would argue.
No, and I would add to that by saying I recognize the force of some comments that this is a very short process. I understand that. The 30 days is if viewed in isolation, is a short period to do this. But number one, the commission has, in terms of power, the discretion to create regulations that implement the purposes of the statute. And the purposes of the statute were to create a mechanism that would allow filing of timely applications to keep this process from moving forward. So I think the solution we've come up with is well within our discretionary powers. Perhaps more important, this is a process that actually has been going on for some considerable period of time. This is not 30 days to first think about the issue and then come to a resolution. The applications, Category 1 applications were filed, the RFA 1 applications were filed on January 15th of this year. That was the deadline. And it's been no secret since January 15th that these proposals were being made. And then we looked at the formal RFA 2 proposals back in October. So more detail was fleshed out there. So we're not starting from scratch with the 30-day commencement of the 30-day window. And that's something that has to be kept in mind in assessing the burden that it's placing on people.
Does that, in your view, Commissioner, deal with the issue that Mr. Tallerman raised in point 3? Mr. Tallerman says that there's a conflict between laws.
Well, if Chapter 251 applies, and that's the issue that we were just talking about.
But you're now saying it does not.
It does not.
Okay.
Then there would be a conflict
Yeah,
between
okay.
the 30-day timelines and the provisions of Chapter 251.
So we have reconciled that, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the item, question number 1 that he raises, which is one we've talked about and one I raised back when we were, how, would somebody explain right now how you think this stands? I mean, what we've said is you have to pick, the arbitrator has to pick between the two best and final offers, but that the arbitrator may make adjustments pursuant to 23K. What does that mean today as a practical matter?
Well, I believe that what that means is the arbitrator can delete provisions or terms that are included if they conflict with 23K. I don't believe that that gives the arbitrator a great deal of leeway to make changes or add provisions to the proposals if in the arbitrator's judgment they think somehow it is allowed under 23K. I view it as more restrictive, I think, than some of the questions I've gotten on that topic. So if you look at the arbitration handbook, what we've suggested is that folks give the arbitrator an agreement, a fully formed contract as their best and final offer. In that situation, I would believe that if there was a term in that contract that violated 23K, the arbitrator could remove that term in making, if they wanted to accept one of the offers, they could remove that term from the offer, and then they could make that as the award. I don't believe the arbitrator has the ability to go in and make large changes because they think under 23K maybe it's not reasonable enough or there's things that should be added. I mean, I think it's much more limited to making sure it doesn't conflict with 23K.
Well, I wonder about that, counsel. The statute says that the commission shall establish protocols and procedures for ensuring the conclusion of a negotiation of a fair and reasonable agreement. What would happen if, and this is obviously a hypothetical, it's not going to happen, but what would happen if there were a situation in which the applicant, in terms of a community impact fee, offered 0, and the surrounding community wanted $1 billion? Certainly, neither one of those is fair and reasonable. Let's assume 0 is not, because it is a surrounding community, so we've determined that
And
there's
there
some
needs to
kind
be
of
a
an
fee.
impact.
That's right.
Some kind of an impact. Certainly, the arbitrator would not be forced to pick one or the other of those, right?
I think that's correct. I think both of them probably violate 23K, so my sense is the arbitrator would have to go back to the parties and request additional input, or they would review, as we've talked about, they can submit other surrounding community agreements from that applicant or another applicant, so maybe the arbitrator could use those as an indication of what was reasonable for that situation.
Yes, but the principle that emerges from that is that the arbitrator does have some ability to
Adjust.
change terms and make adjustments in order to ensure that the result is fair and reasonable, but that the arbitrator ought to exercise restraint in doing that. I gather that's how.
I would agree with that. I think in that situation, the arbitrator would be best advised to go out and ask for another submission, as opposed to imposing their own judgment on that, that they would get potentially another submission if it was that far apart.
Well, yeah, but let's just follow this all the way through, because if these people aren't going to go to arbitration, people that go to arbitration are likely to be locked up. And let's assume the arbitrator asks for another submission and it turns out to be $100 and $900 million. And now the deadline's approaching. It seems to me the arbitrator has to have the ability to make changes that will assure a fair and reasonable outcome in the last analysis, even though they're not in either side's offer. But because this is the model that we're using is a best and final offer process, the arbitrator needs to exercise restraint before diving in and imposing her own view of what's fair and reasonable on the parties. I don't see any other way to reconcile it.
You know, I think it's taking examples to extreme situations is helpful to kind of try to gauge incentives. I would argue in the first case that you talk about, the 0 and a billion, the specter or the probability, however small, that could occur should incentivize the parties.
No question.
To say, maybe, if we think it's $1 billion, but we could end up with 0, maybe we should rethink the $1 billion.
Right.
And it works both ways the same way. Right. If we think that it's something more than 0, we don't want to be in a position to be having to fork over $1 billion because it kills our proposal. So one could argue that just that small probability, however that is, that the arbitrator does not exercise or exercises a lot of discretion on that basis, should get people to a reasonable, in their mind, proposal or offer. But I take your point. It's not an easy one because people come from different angles, right. From different perspectives. Right. Surrounding communities could come from a place of I don't want this in the first place, etc.
So I think I fully agree with that. It should, the whole best and final thing is designed to incentivize people to come to put reasonable proposals on the table.
Right.
But this is really the question I was discussing, and I think that's being raised in this question is a question of power. What does the arbitrator have
Yep.
the power to do if the parties aren't incentivized to come to the table with reasonable proposals? Can the arbitrator produce something that is reasonable?
And I think there's a tremendous precedent at that point. I would argue, like it's been argued, that similar agreements with other surrounding communities should be a factor, that prior offers, whether higher or lower, to the best and final, should be taken into account, because that may also, coupled with the other surrounding communities, could gauge reasonability to the proposal. I think it gets very dicey in the sense of people tend to, for the right reasons, focus on an impact fee, but there's so many other things that factor in. Assumptions about the future that we don't know for sure, what those impacts are going to be, et cetera, et cetera.
we wrote
I
this,
don't know
right?
where that leaves us.
We wrote this, so, I mean, if we don't understand it, it's pretty clear that they aren't gonna understand it. So we either need to amend it and say whatever it is, I don't exactly know for sure, I don't think we agree on exactly what we mean. It seems to me that if you give the arbitrator the right to make this fair and reasonable, then they have the right to make it fair and reasonable by their judgment, which, and if that's what we want, fine, then let's say that's what we want. If that's not what we want, then let's try to constrain it with explicit language that defines what we do want.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add just a little texture to the conversation. As you referenced, we do have the benefit of having written this. And I can offer my recollection as to the legislative intent, if you will, to this provision.
Pull the
Originally,
mic over just a little bit, Todd. Yeah.
originally, when this whole process was being put together, my recollection was that it was designed so that it was essentially all or nothing. It was best and final. Each party came in with an offer.
This is the way we designed it.
Well, as it was being designed internally, and that was finally approved by the commission, yes.
But you said legislative intent, but you're talking about the commission.
Well, the commission intent, the regulatory intent.
Right.
So it wasn't the legislature. It was your intent.
Right.
It was a best and final. It was all or nothing. You know, the arbitrator
Right.
had to pick one. And we said, hold on a second. That's not going to work 100%. So that's why the commission added this sentence in here, which said, at least my recollection, that the arbitrator may make adjustments to the selected best and final offer only if necessary to ensure the report is consistent with Chapter 23K. It was intended to be a very narrow, I believe, authority that was going to be given to the arbitrator to make adjustments to the extent that one of the proposals was clearly fairer than the other, but there was some provision in there that would be inconsistent, legally speaking, with Chapter 23K. For example, if it extinguished the other side's right to do something it could legally do, like access the Community Mitigation Fund or something like that, that the arbitrator does have the flexibility to accept the proposal, but take that one clause out. My recollection, it was not intended to give the arbitrator broad authority to redraft or recraft the provisions, whether the monetary provisions or otherwise, to ensure that they accomplish the objectives of 23K. That, I think, approach was set aside in an effort to do what Commissioner Zuniga has and others have suggested, which is to almost force the parties to come together to some kind of agreement short of arbitration. But, as you may recall, the commission added one additional provision into the arbitration section in the event that a best and final offer was selected that neither of the parties felt was really fair. And that was that after the arbitrator selected one of the offers, that the parties then had an additional 5 days to look at the report issued by the arbitrator and to sign a surrounding community agreement. So they could go back to the drawing board and rewrite the agreement in any way they saw fit. So if it was the difference between 0 and $1 billion, and the arbitrator was forced to pick one, both sides could agree that that's not fair, and let's go back to this number. And that provision was built in to allow the parties to have the final say as to what the terms of the agreement would be. And in fact, if they were unable to do that after the arbitrator picked one or the other, that the parties would have to live with one best or final offer or the other. And I bring that up now just to bring you back to, this is many months ago when this provision was drafted. That's my recollection of where this came from, but that it was not to afford great latitude to the arbitrator to essentially come up with a fair agreement.
So the bottom line of that is that this process is not a process designed necessarily to produce a fair and reasonable agreement.
Well,
It doesn't have to, it does not have to produce a fair and reasonable agreement.
It doesn't have to produce what is in the mind of the arbitrator, a fair and reasonable agreement.
Right,
Well-
insofar as you believe that neither of the parties came with a fair or reasonable proposal,
It could wind up producing a surrounding community agreement that was not fair and reasonable. Take the 0 billion. I mean, that could be the result of it is, I raised that because that was not my understanding of this when we started out. And I may have been a minority and I may have failed to articulate my concerns, but I certainly didn't read it that way. I thought that the fair and reasonable requirements of the statute were an overlay to this entire best and reasonable process.
In my memory of it, I remember that it was, that we talked about the baseball model, and we adopted largely, I think, the baseball model, which is designed to force settlement, force agreement. I wasn't particularly comfortable with it at the time, but then I remember the lots of stuff going on, but that was my memory. I think Commissioner Zuniga was really an advocate of that position. But be that as, I mean, we do need to be good if we could agree on what it was we were intending to do.
Right.
But in any event, you know, we wrote it in such a way that reasonable people can differ on its intent. And I think we have to figure out what it is we are giving, what instructions we are indeed giving our arbitrators and the two parties that are out and out there trying to negotiate, not knowing for sure what the rules of arbitration are. So I think we need to have an emergency amendment to the reg, or at least something that will provide binding direction to the arbitrator that resolves this issue one way or the other, whatever mechanism we use to do that.
We made this decision. There are questions, because maybe, you know, it's hard to write it in a way that clearly articulates. But are you suggesting that now we go back and change and go to a new standard, which,
No, I'm just saying we should clarify whatever it is we were trying to say. Right, even amongst ourselves at the moment, we're not agreeing on what it was we were trying to say, and we know that the parties don't know for sure what we were trying to say.
I do think that, you know, what we've written, as you've explained it, which is pick one or the other with minor adjustments. First of all, the conflict with Chapter 23K is an easy one. If there's really a provision there that doesn't belong, but they thought they could throw it in there to come to a resolution, is very important. But if the arbitrator has a little bit of leeway in that context, and with the additional 5 days to come to an adjustment between the parties, would be, in my opinion, at least in theory, very useful. It would accomplish our need to resolve this quickly, but also incentivize the parties to really come with their best proposal, something that can be deemed reasonable.
I would hope it would be very unlikely that someone would come in with an extremely unreasonable offer. At this point, they've been at this for some time now. I would hope that that would not be the case. And in fact, you know, that would be something we'd be looking at when we have decisions to make here, and if we think someone is really being unreasonable, you know, especially on the side of the applicant, I think that that would not be a wise move when we are evaluating all of their abilities to work effectively with communities. We're looking at that in the mitigation piece of this, so I would think that would be unlikely, and I don't know that it's all that helpful to talk about extremes right now at this late date. If we need some more clarification, that would be fine, but...
Just for the record, I don't think the extremes, I don't think we're necessarily expecting that people are going to come in 0 to billion. I think Commissioner McHugh was just, we're trying to establish the principle. Does the arbitrator have the right to interpose his or her judgment on what's fair and reasonable under 23K? And he was just using an extreme case to suggest, yeah, there is some room. So if there's room on the extreme case, you know, then you back down to the more how do you come up with a principle? That's the point here.
Well,
What the arbitrator can do.
Well,
How much discretion does the arbitrator have?
my recollection is certainly the way Todd explained it, very narrow. Just if there's a piece of it that does not conform with, we're not looking at a judgment at that point, we're looking at a legal basis. And I do remember having those conversations, and what the reason for that was to have them be able to do this ahead of time and really force someone to enter into a good faith negotiation. So.
I also think, I keep thinking of there's many factors into this. There's an over-focus, in my opinion, on an impact fee, 0 and $1 billion in this extreme example. But we've already seen in some of these agreements, a 1 year, we'll come back and revisit this. We'll agree that we'll mitigate the measurable impacts a year from now and pay for all of that. That carries a present value of 0, but a future value that a community may live with. And when you add those kinds of provisions with anything else that they can come up with, compare them with surrounding communities that have executed surrounding community agreements, thankfully, and and look at however many offers have been made or rejected in the past. I would like to think that an arbitrator would, with all that context, come up with one or another as to what is fair and reasonable. With the ability of minor suggestions, sorry.
Yeah. We keep talking about desirable outcomes, and nobody can disagree with any of these desirable outcomes. But the real question is power. Assuming that we've got a bad situation, and we may, in some cases, what power does the arbitrator have? And I would not be in favor of an emergency correction to this regulation now. I think this is certainly being interpreted in a way that is different from the way I understood it. I would like to reopen the bidding on this for the next set of licenses and go through this and think about it again. But for present purposes, it
For the
seems...
slots licenses?
No, for the
For
casino
present
license.
purpose. You
No.
reopen the casino.
Leave this in place now. I think it's too disruptive to the process, given where it is now, to try and create an emergency change to it. People have got expectations that are reasonably settled, and they've been working on them for a while. But I would like to reopen for the casino licenses this discussion, because I don't think that this is the best way to go. I may lose that ultimately if we reopen it. What I do think is a break, and I hadn't thought of it, but it emerged as I think something Commissioner Cameron said, is the fact that once this is done, if the arbitrator is forced to pick between two borderline unreasonable alternatives, ultimately the commission can and will take into account the reasonableness of the surrounding community agreements as a whole in making a license award decision. So if in the 0 and $1 billion case, the commission would be probably hard-pressed to award the license to the applicant, and I'm only speaking for myself. I, as a commissioner, would be hard-pressed to award a license to an applicant that was offering 0, or a surrounding community that was getting $1 billion. So I think that break is what we have to rely on here, and it would be an additional incentivizer for the people to come together with something that was reasonable, unless there was a community that simply didn't want to have this thing at all.
So your advice to communities, applicants, and arbitrators now on how to interpret our reg is what?
Is that is that the best and final offer is the picking between one or the other of the offers is the preferred outcome with such changes as are necessary to deal with some provision of the agreement that clearly violates 23K.
And
And
is,
it is not a broad empowerment to the arbitrator to impose her own notions of what's fair and reasonable.
and it is, if we agreed with that,
Right.
by consensus or whatever
Right.
mechanism, does that do the job of telling the arbitrators what to do?
I think that it does. I mean, we can never get, and shouldn't strive to get, a perfect set, a set of directions that allows no maneuvering room for the arbitrator. We can't do it. We can't get there. And I think that's about as close as we can get to a channeling of the arbitrator's undoubted discretion.
But
Best and final, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, this is a real question, not a rhetorical question. So communities have been asking, folks have been asking us for clarification on this. Is agreeing to your interpretation and having that be in the minutes of our meeting, is that binding clarification so that the arbitrators must conform with that and the parties there know that? Do we do the job of clarifying this by just having this in our minutes?
I would take the step of putting it in the handbook.
In the
that is
handbook as
given
well,
to the arbitrator.
yes.
Right.
And having it in there in the form that we're comfortable with, i.e. I just articulated a thought, I'd like to see that in writing, but that would
Right.
basically be the thought. And I would like to see it in the handbook.
That's where we would add it.
And then I would like to stop, I'll stop.
Commissioners, just to be clear, I don't think anyone is advocating that an arbitrator can do a traditional, this entity offered 1 million, this entity offered 500 million, let's cut it in the middle and end it at that. What you're talking about is basing the two offers based on fairness and reasonableness, and whether or not something could be amended would be based on whether or not it complies with that portion of the statute. We're not telling arbitrators that they should cut things in the middle.
We are not, no. And-
Quite the opposite.
and Quite the opposite if, right now. And I think we would want to stay, even if we reopen this for the next group, we would want to stay away from just arbitrator, you do whatever you think is right. But I'd like to fine tune it to make these
Right.
clarifications.
Okay, well, I definitely agree, as you know, that we do need to clarify it. I am quite mixed on what I think is the right way to go, but I'm certainly okay to go with a position at the moment if that's sort of the sense that that's been where we really were intending. Is it possible to read back what Commissioner McHugh said? Yeah,
No,
Well-
it's right here.
what Commissioner McHugh said?
No, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, what Commissioner McHugh articulated a limit on the discretion of the arbitrator. And it was basically along the lines of what you were saying.
Yes.
And I thought it was well said. It's all right, we'll go ahead.
It's alluded to in the handbook. We could tighten up the language.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
No, no,
it's-
it's not in the handbook.
It's not
Right, that's what I'm
exactly
talking
in the
about,
handbook,
is-
but we can tighten that language up and we can bring the handbook back to you for your
Okay.
review.
Is everybody okay with that as this intent?
Yeah.
Clarifying this intent and
Yes.
articulated basically the way Commissioner McHugh did. Okay, so that it tells folks who are involved in this process where we're coming from, and we will memorialize that as clearly as possible in the handbook.
And then we'll put the handbook up on the web promptly, so that
Yes.
everybody is up on
Make it
up on
freely
our
available.
website.
And we'll put in the tickler file to reopen this when we talk about the next round.
Right.
Okay. I had one other question on the draft itself of the handbook. Under considerations for the arbitrators in arriving at the final decision,
Page?
7. Well, it sort of seemed like all of this goes counter to what we just got through talking about. And I don't know how you reconcile all this. This is giving the arbitrator a series of criteria, which are not limited even to these criteria, to determine fair and reasonableness. And it invites precisely the action that we think we just got through saying we didn't want to take. So,
I'm not sure I agree with that.
okay, well, that's fine. It says the arbitrator must arrive at a fair and reasonable agreement. The arbitrator, or arbitrators, must arrive at a fair and reasonable agreement. To do that, the arbitrators may consider and evaluate a whole range of factors.
Right.
How is that not inviting them to do what we just got through saying we didn't want them to do?
Well, if you're gonna select one or the other, you have to take into consideration all of these things. They're all
Then it really
encompassing.
should
They're
say
all-
must select, not arrive at.
Okay, yes.
Well, that's a huge difference. I mean, this, I
It
don't
is a
understand,
huge difference.
I don't understand how this was written, given the attitude that you were expressing earlier. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So if I'm right, and if we want to go the way Commissioner McHugh just said, I think we have to either eliminate or certainly radically change this section.
Well, we could just eliminate the word arrive and supplant it with the word select.
As between the two
As
choices
between the
must
two
select.
We
choices,
can-
subject to inconsistencies with 23K. But all of the rest of the factors continue to be very relevant. Is that a
I
fair
think they
statement?
probably included the word arrive, recognizing that there could be modifications, so it may not be the selection of the two best and final offers that were offered. If the arbitrator needed to modify, that's how they arrive at. But I think that both the commissioner's language of selecting subject to modifications pursuant to
Yeah.
the earlier section to
We
would be
can,
clarifying.
yeah, I mean, we can certainly make that change. I think they're factors that come from the statute and the regs, and I think we wanted to point out to the arbitrator, these are the kinds of issues that they would see. But we can clean up that language to say they have to select one or the other based upon these factors.
Right. And then the last thing is, if we do want to give them parameters, is to use in selecting between the two proposals. Isn't there, what about the parameter of the positive benefits? This is one we've always found a little confusing, but we didn't list, isn't there a parameter of the positive benefits? Why is that not listed?
Yeah, we can add that, that is in our regulations, that we can consider
And in
the
this-
positive
and in the
impacts.
law, I
And
think.
in the law, too.
In
So
the law.
we'll add that as a factor.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
okay. Okay, so I'm sure everybody feels totally clarified now. So we'll do a quick redraft. Now, how are we going to do this now? Well, let's see, the arbitration processes will be starting when?
The 27th.
27th of
Of
December?
December,
That's
right.
when the arbitration
And
period
we don't have any
opens.
more meetings.
Well, we can approve this based on these limited language adjustments.
And maybe designate to the general counsel and Commissioner McHugh the ability to fine-tune the language, which will then be adopted on our behalf.
That would
Yes.
work.
That's good.
Yep, we could do that.
That's fine with me.
Okay. Do we need a motion to that effect, or is it okay just to leave it?
I
as
think that
is?
would be helpful to have the motion
Okay.
on the record.
Commissioner McHugh, do you want to do this again?
All right. I move that the commission adopt the document entitled Handbook for Binding Arbitration Between an Applicant and a Gaming Establishment Licensee, an applicant for a gaming establishment license and a surrounding community to reach a surrounding community agreement with modifications conforming to the discussion the commission just concluded, and that will be reflected in the transcript of the commission's meeting.
And delegate to the general counsel and to Commissioner McHugh to approve those amendments.
Yes.
Okay. For a
I
second?
second.
Any more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have unanimously.
Okay, thank you. The next item on our list is early application filings. We have heard that perhaps some applications will be filed earlier than December 31st. The question that comes up then, we have a number of timelines that we have advised applicants would run, we've said from the 31st, assuming people file on that date. So we thought the commission could consider how we would like the timelines to run. For example, assenting to a designation or filing a petition, whether the commission would want those dates to run from the 31st, whether the applications are filed sooner or not, or whether the commission would go with the regulations as written and have those timelines run from the date the application's actually filed. We think that perhaps for communities in applicant planning situations, the 31st has a date we've always had out there. It might be better to have all of those run from the 31st as currently scheduled.
I think it makes sense to use the 31st. Certainly, we have holidays before that could potentially shorten that tight time frame. So having everybody know, no matter if they submit it on the 27th, that clock starts on the 31st makes sense. There's some consistency for everyone as far as scheduling and holidays and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. To do that, we would want to vote on a variance from our regulations, that we would set our date to be the 31st, whether they're filed on the 31st or not, and moving forward from there.
Well, I'm sorry, I agree that the deadline should remain the same, after which the dates start counting for assenting and those kinds of things, but couldn't we always receive early applications?
Well, we can. We can
mean,
always
they just-
receive them. That's not the problem.
We can just sort
It's
of put
just
them in a closet.
some things are tied to when the application is filed. And it is a fair question that's been raised to us because some communities are looking at continuing negotiations, thinking that they can continue their negotiations, out to the 31st. Some are trying to decide whether they would petition or not if they weren't designated, so they're trying to think in advance when that petition would be due. It's also the holidays. Some communities don't have meetings. If they need meetings to take certain actions, it would be difficult. So we just wanted to try and clarify that in the event applications are in fact filed either late this week or next week before the 31st.
Because we tied certain things to the filing of the application, not the deadline for filing of the
Yes.
application.
That's
I
right.
didn't realize that, okay. So I agree. If that's the case, I didn't realize that was the case. So we need to, what does that mean? We need to have an emergency amendment to the regs?
No, we would just grant a variance for those timelines. Instead of running from the filing of the application itself, it would run from December 31st. For those regulations that are tied to the filing of the RFA2, instead of running from the
Okay.
date the app's filed, it would run from the 31st.
Okay.
Similar to what we did
Is
in
there
surrounding.
any, excuse me,
No, go ahead.
well, I'm just, I agree with that, so I'm in favor of that. Is there any other consequence that we need to think about of receiving the applications early? When they become public, we have our own administrative review process in place. Is there any other consequence of early receipt that we need to think about? Would it become public? We release it, right? The applicant doesn't release it.
The applicant sends portions of it to the larger surrounding
Right.
communities group. So they would potentially get them earlier, but in terms of doing the administrative completeness review, I haven't discussed this with Executive Director Day, but I don't believe he would start before the 31st.
Which
They came in
is
early.
fine, right. I was just trying to think of other consequences. And so I guess if an applicant wants to make the application public, that's their right. We don't have any problem with that.
One very minor point is that applicants are in the process right now of printing their applications, and there's a lot of notices that have been included. For example, in our regulations, if you designate a community as a surrounding community in your application, you have to provide them notice that within 10 days of the application, they have to provide their assent to the commission. So I don't think that we would be asking applicants to go in and extract those letters that they've already printed from their applications. We can just clarify
Right.
to those communities that have been designated that they have an additional couple days if something has been submitted.
Can you handle that all right?
Yes.
Okay, so you can take care of that, okay. Okay. Somebody want to put this into the appropriate motion?
I move that for purposes of, well, first of all, it seems to me that the 4 criteria for a variance are met here. It's in the public interest, it's consistent with the statute, it is, would be a hardship on surrounding communities if we didn't do this, and it otherwise is a sound exercise of the commission's discretion. So all of the criteria for a variance from the rule, from the regulation as written in the case of early filed applications are met. So I would move, under those circumstances, that for all timelines that are tied in our regulations to the date on which an RFA 2 application for a Category 1 license is filed, that the date that the timeline commence on December 31 and not any earlier date on which the application is in fact filed. Does that do it?
That works.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Ayes have unanimously.
Okay, thank you. And the last question under the legal update is the question about the lottery Keno machines and slots. We've been asked the question as to whether the number of Keno machines count towards the number of slot machines that are permitted in a gaming establishment. We have looked at those regulations. We believe they do not. I'll let Mr. Grossman explain the legal analysis behind it, but we have some folks that are looking for clarity on that. So Todd, if you want to explain that.
Sure. The place to start with this issue is the definition of slot machine, which is found in Chapter 23K, Section 2, and it's somewhat lengthy, but there are a couple of important parts of it. It defines it essentially as a mechanical, electrical, or other device, contrivance, or machine, which upon insertion of a coin, token, or similar object therein, or upon payment of any consideration whatsoever, is available to play or operate. And then it goes through a number of other provisos that have to be met in order for it to be considered a slot machine. But I think in the context of this question, those are the important parts. So ultimately, based upon a review of the Lottery Commission website where it outlines how Keno is played and my own personal experience having played Keno before, and assuming that those are the types of machines that will be included at the gaming establishments, it seems reasonably clear that for a couple of reasons that those types of machines should not be included within the definition of a slot machine. First is that the player, him or herself, doesn't actually play or operate the machine. They fill out a ticket with their numbers and hand it to someone else, the operator, who then runs it through the lottery machine. So from that perspective alone, I would suggest that it wouldn't be a slot machine. That again assumes that the machines that would be placed at the casinos wouldn't be any different from the machines that are presently in operation. And secondly, it seems unlikely that when this definition was drafted by the legislature that they intended to include these Keno machines within the definition as they are independently overseen by the state lottery. So that's kind of a basic analysis of the definition of slot machine as it relates to Keno machines that I would be comfortable with at this point.
I would agree. I think the question of the player operation is critical because if I'm at a slot machine, it's up to me to hit the button. Keno is played in a consistent, timely process. Not to mention all the practical reasons why we wouldn't want these to be considered as part of the count for a required number of slots in the slots part. I would agree with your analysis.
Yeah,
Anybody else?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Commissioner Stebbins alluded to the practical reasons, but if for whatever reason, we were to take the opposite view that Keno machines counted against slot machines, we would be in a very uncomfortable situation of being pitted against the lottery, for one, and that would make, for every Keno machine, it would make the financial feasibility of the slots parlor considerably less. So thank you for that sound legal analysis. In my opinion, I'm all in agreement.
I agree as well.
Sounds like we don't need to vote for this. You can
No.
just, you're going
No,
to give
we'll
this
vote.
advice to people who asked.
Yes.
Right, okay.
That's all we have unless the commission has any questions for us.
No?
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Next is the Ombudsman report from Ombudsman Ziemba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Executive Director Day asked me to go over the licensing schedule update that we've included in your packets. And what this update is a reflection of an understanding of where we think we are today with Category 2 applicants and where we may be soon with Category 1 applicants. What this should be viewed as is a schedule that is perhaps the most extended schedule based on if all applicants or one applicant and a community go to arbitration, and then that arbitration extends to the entire amount of time that is allowable under our regulations. The way that our licensing schedule works is that we cannot issue a final determination on a license until all surrounding community agreements have been concluded. So necessarily, even if just one applicant and one community are involved in arbitration, that extends our licensing timeline. Although this may seem as a conservative approach, the one that we're putting forward before you, I think that there is a likelihood that we'll have such an arbitration in either Category 1, Category 2, or potentially both. So let me just walk through some of the key dates for you. First, let me start with Category 2, then I'll move on to Category 1. So as we've discussed, the 30-day negotiation period with Category 2 applicants and communities, that ends on the 26th of December. As a reminder, we have currently Bolton, Foxborough, Easton, and Bridgewater that are still in negotiations. Middleborough and West Bridgewater have reached agreements. Starting 12/27, the arbitration process begins. By January 6th, the parties will select an arbitrator or arbitrators and submit their best and final offers to those arbitrator or arbitrators. The parties arbitrate for 20 days and then have an opportunity for 5 calendar days to negotiate following the arbitration.
5 calendar days?
Yeah, so under, Mr. Grossman's really good at this, but the definition of days under our regulation, for any days that are less than 7 days, you exclude Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. If it is over 7 days, those are included within the definition of days. So when I've been saying 30 days of arbitration forever, that's not really true,
Right,
because
I
30
understand.
days is
Yeah,
5
you
plus
just used the
20 plus
expression
5.
calendar days, which, yeah, okay, fine, gotcha.
So on February 3rd, after those 5 plus 20 plus 5 days, arbitration would be complete. So if arbitration is complete at this latest point, we could conclude our host community hearings on February 5th or perhaps February 6th. We penciled in those dates for potential meetings where we could conclude the host community hearings. And by statute, the commission cannot render a decision until 30 days after the close of the host community hearings. So therefore, given this, we have a projected of a decision on Category 2 license on March 7th. That's if arbitration continues to the full extent that it is allowed to. So now for category one, December 31st is the application date. As we've just decided, January 10th will be the date for surrounding community petitions. So on that date, those communities that want to petition to become a surrounding community shall send in that to the commission. Also on that date, any community that has been designated as a surrounding community in an application, but they have not reached an agreement with the applicant, we would expect that those assent letters reach the commission by that January 10th date or earlier, pursuant to the notices sent by the applicant. On January 21st, applicants are required to provide their response to surrounding community petitions to the commission. They're given that response period under our regulations. What we anticipate is that potentially on January 22nd, at the commission meeting, we could have presentations by the Category 1 applicants. These are the 90-minute presentations of each one of the Region A and Region B applicants. The very next day, on January 23rd, we could have potential presentations by the surrounding community petitioners and applicants. And that would allow us some time to, on February 6th, make decisions on those surrounding community petitions. But we could also designate those communities that have been designated in a surrounding community, designated as surrounding communities in an application as a surrounding community. So basically, under our regulations, a surrounding community can be included in an application by being designated, but the 30-day statutory negotiation period does not start until we issue a written determination that that community is a surrounding community. So for all intents and purposes, if you're designated in an application, you are a surrounding community, but the way that we've crafted our regulations is that the 30-day statutory period of negotiation doesn't tick until we issue that written determination. And as was decided at a previous meeting, we talked about treating the surrounding community petitioners and those designated on the same timeline. So as of February 6th, that would begin the 30-day of negotiations.
Right.
One good thing about this date is that it would allow communities that have not been able to reach an agreement, a pretty significant period of time from the application date to February 6th to reach an agreement, and then 30 days thereafter, there's another 30 days of negotiation period. So, as we've discussed, there's very valuable information in those applications. People have talked about the lack of information, a lack of studies. Hopefully those applications will be robust and include everything that they're supposed to under the statute, so that communities can be in a position to negotiate agreements by that February 6th date. If they cannot reach that date by February 6th, they have the additional 30 days of negotiation. So after February 6th, on February 25th to February 27th, we could potentially have surrounding community public input hearings. These would be scheduled out in the surrounding communities. They would be after we have designated the communities which are that have petitioned, so we will know the universe of those communities that are surrounding communities. And thereafter, February 25th to 27th. On March 10th would be the end of the 30-day surrounding community negotiation period, the statutory period. Beginning on March 11th, that would be the beginning of arbitration. April 14th, that would be the end of the arbitration after the 30, quote-unquote, 30 days. After the 14th of April, April 28th to April 30th, we could have our host community hearings. After those host community hearings, we could then in turn make an award potentially by May 30th. We are disallowed, as you know, to award anything earlier than 30 days after the conclusion of the host community hearings.
Why are we going to, the arbitrations are going to be finished on the 14th. Why are we going to wait until the 28th to begin the statutory hearings?
There's 2 commissioners on vacation on those weeks.
1 week.
1 week, and then there's an overlap of others.
That was
Is
the-
that a correct?
There are commissioner vacations scheduled for April. I think it's like the third week
That's February, I'm sorry. There's school vacation
in April.
in April.
Yeah.
And one commissioner, myself, may be out or maybe in, but
But also a lot of people
a
are.
lot of
Correct.
people are.
Yes.
And having the host community hearing during school vacation was something that we avoided in the schedule.
Okay, then here's my concern. I'm not sure that we are going to finish these statutory hearings in one day. For the category 2, we had a couple of really long days.
These were the public input meetings as opposed to the statutory meetings.
No, the statutory meetings that we had for the category 2
The host community.
in the host communities, which is what we're talking about for the
Yeah.
4th to the 30th, the 28th, 29th, and 30th. The ones that we had for the category 2s, each of them started at 4. One went till 9:30, and the another went till 8:30, and then we had one that was much shorter. And that's fine, but I think these are going to be more complex and require a lot more attention than the category 2s did. We held the category 2s a long time ago, and we're going, not relatively long time ago, and we're going to go back and close them with only the issues that came up after surrounding community agreements were signed. Why don't we adopt the same process here? I'm sorry. Why don't we adopt the same process here and give ourselves the option of having these hearings for a couple of days, if necessary, rather than crowd them in where we really won't have any time under this schedule. We really have to get these licensing decisions made by the 30th of May for a variety, if it's at all possible of doing. But why don't we have the host community statutory hearing sometime in late March? And then, as we did before, close them after the surrounding community process is finished, if necessary.
Or as an alternative, there is some time available that week of April 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th before the school vacation week, where potentially you could host a hearing.
Where are the public input meetings?
Oh,
The
right
surrounding
away.
community meetings?
No, the public input, they're not reflected in the schedule, but they're right after,
Yeah, no, so those are
Good,
February
at the end of
25th to the
February.
27th,
Okay, so they'd be out of the way.
surrounding community public input hearings.
yeah.
We don't really have to nail this down, and I know
No.
Director Day is
Right.
tracking this, but I think this is a really good suggestion. And
Yes.
anything that we can
Have them
do
earlier.
would be helpful. And I don't, on the face of it, I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that. And that might save a couple of weeks, which would be great.
Yeah, I agree. I suspect, I wasn't in this drafting or redrafting of the schedule, but I suspect part of the impetus was to have only one hearing or a set of hearings after all surrounding community agreements had been executed and arbitrated. But I think the cost that you point out, being very close to our next fiscal year, it outweighs the notion of having one of those public hearings.
Yeah, well, I would like to, I agree, we can't pin it down now, but I would like to give this some more thought.
Yeah. I think it's a really helpful suggestion. And obviously, the other thing, and I know you're doing this, is to remind the applicants and the host communities, the applicants and the surrounding communities that this schedule is problematic for us, and we're encouraging them to get this done, so the need to go to arbitration doesn't screw up our whole schedule. Continue to.
Yeah, it was my hope to get the message out to communities that are contemplating negotiations, at least though the early date of the February 6th date of the likely date that we would make determinations on those designated surrounding communities. Should I wait until we discuss this again before making those communications, or does that sound something like that I could do to
Why would there be reason to wait?
Well, I think you just discussed that you might want to revisit some parts of the schedule, or?
Well, but that's later part of the schedule. I don't think,
So, I'm just confirming,
Yeah,
so
no,
it's just that portion of the schedule?
unless I'm missing something, there's no problem going ahead and confirming what you're saying. Commissioner McHugh's suggestion is a month later, a month or two later.
Right.
Okay, great. I was just confirming that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on the master schedule?
Nope.
Believe it or not, we're going to have to start talking about Region C sometime fairly soon. Okay.
I'll just give you, I gave a little bit of an update on Category 2. As I noted, there are 4 outstanding, both in Foxborough, Easton, and Bridgewater. Middleborough reached an agreement on Monday, December 16th. West Bridgewater reached an agreement on December 11th. In regard to the remaining, I'm not going to go into too much detail as I'm privy to a lot of information regarding negotiations on both parts. But I will say that depending on the time of the day, I'm rather optimistic or pessimistic. Thankfully, I concluded the end of the day.
Council Lee is smiling as you say that.
Thankfully, well, I talk to Ms. Lee quite often and thank her for that. Thankfully, at the end of the day, I think I ended on a positive note yesterday, and that has not been ruined so far this morning. I haven't looked at my email, but I think that there still is a very good possibility that the applicants and communities could reach a negotiated settlement, if not by the 26th, potentially even shortly thereafter. And
All of them, are you saying? Or-
there is possibility of that.
Wow.
And a slight possibility, but there's a possibility of that. And what we've told people is that parties can continue to negotiate even during the arbitration period. And specifically, specifically in that window period between the beginning of arbitration on the 27th and January 5th, excuse me, is it January 5th?
5th or 6th.
January 5th or 6th, when they actually have to commence the actual arbitration, the selection of the arbitrators. That time seems to be ripe for reaching a real settlement. And so I'm very optimistic because true expenses really start kicking in very shortly after the 27th, and they really start kicking in once the 20-day arbitration occurs. And depending on how things go, as you know, the arbitration costs are split between the community and the applicant if they cannot decide on a single arbitrator, which could be a very likely outcome. Split two-thirds to one-third.
Right.
I would, I fully agree with that, but I'd take it even a step farther, and all the things that you said are exactly on, but the arbitration and negotiation aren't mutually exclusive, and I would strongly encourage communities, even if the arbitration process is started, to continue to negotiate.
Exactly.
Because the agreements they come to are going to be far better and more satisfactory than the agreements picked by a third party, however wise.
Right.
Well, let's hope that the holidays put people in good mood when they're contemplating
The
these.
holiday spirit.
And I would also, I would argue, no, not argue, there's been real expenses incurred by the applicant and to a lesser degree, but equally important by all communities, because time is also been a big factor for everybody here. So one would hope that they come to a resolution soon.
And just while you mention that, Commissioner, just another note, I've said this before, but we are going to begin utilizing resources to analyze surrounding community petitions for Category 1s very soon, because if we have a number of those, it's going to take a tremendous amount of staff and consultant work to get decisions or to get recommendations to the Commission by the 6th of February. These applications are going to be 4,000 to 5,000 pages each, and to get that done in that shorter period of time is going to be a rather intense period. So we hope that no applicant forgets to leave off a surrounding community off their list if they believe that that surrounding community is likely to experience impacts. Obviously, it's up to them to make those designations, but we hope that they do so wisely.
Okay, great. Anything else? Thank you, Ombudsman.
Thank you.
That concludes all of our posted topics. Under item 6, other business reserved for matters the chair did not reasonably anticipate at the time of posting. I just want to mention one thing and get a go-ahead from the commission, if I may, if I can. You know that we're in negotiations with the Department of Public Health to work out a memorandum of understanding which will govern the Public Health Trust Fund. They also are looking to hire a director of, I'm not sure, the administrator of research and problem gambling, who will be a counterpart to our director of research and problem gambling. They don't have all of the funding to pay for that position. They have $50,000 in this fiscal year sequestered for this position, but it might cost more than that this fiscal year. May not also, but it might. And we have told them that we would support whatever the costs are. We would pay whatever the costs are for this person until the Public Health Trust Fund gets up and running, in which case we can bill the Public Health Trust Fund for this. So if it's okay, I would just like the authorization maybe for Commissioner Zuniga and me to negotiate with Department of Public Health and be willing to put whatever relatively small amount of money this fiscal year is required on the table to pay for that extra person if need be. I think we're pretty clear on this, but I just wanted to mention, I heard from them just recently that they did have the $50,000, but they didn't have any more than that, and it might require some money for us this fiscal year, and I want to show them that we're really moving and responsive. So if that's okay, I don't know that we really need a vote on this, but because it's a relatively small amount of money, but I just wanted to get a,
Sounds reasonable, Mr. Chair.
okay.
Well, it does sound reasonable to me, too. I look forward, having said that, to the presentation of the upcoming budget. And I take it that this has all been, whatever small amount of money is going to be required contingently, has been looked at in the context of budget preparations that are now ongoing. Is that a fair?
That's fair. This is, a small amount at this point, but every small amount counts when we're talking about in the aggregate. And our new CFO, Derek Lennon, and Director Day and I have been working towards a financial report coming early January that closes our second quarter comparison, and compare that to what we know, that we know now a lot more in terms of assumptions that we made at the beginning of this fiscal year and cash flow that comes soon after we award the licenses. So we'll have an update on that projection early January, and we're looking at things very closely because we have to.
Okay. And I did talk about this with Commissioner Zuniga and CFAO Lennon before I brought it up here.
Okay.
Okay, that's it for item 6, unless anybody else has anything. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, folks.
Happy holidays.
Wow, happy holidays. Yeah. Last meeting before 2014.